Imagine this. A man the entire country thinks is guilty. A case watched by millions live every single day. Evidence so overwhelming that even decades later, people still ask the same question. How did he walk free? Not did he do it, but how did the system let him go? Because this isn't just a murder case. This is a story about power, perception, and the quiet legal loopholes that can change history. And once you see them, you'll never look at the justice system the same way again. This is the story of O.J. Simpson. Before the trial, before the headlines, before the white Bronco, O.J. Simpson was not just famous, he was beloved. To millions of Americans, O.J. was the definition of success. A record-breaking NFL superstar, a charming TV personality, a pitchman selling cars, smiling on commercials, welcomed into living rooms across the country. He wasn't seen as dangerous. He wasn't seen as angry. He was seen as safe. That image mattered more than anyone realized at the time, because when the story would later turn dark, unimaginably dark, the country struggled to reconcile two versions of the same man, the hero and the suspect. June 12, 1994, a quiet Sunday night in Los Angeles. In an upscale neighborhood called Brentwood, two bodies were found outside a condominium. Nicole Brown Simpson, O.J.'s ex-wife, and Ronald Goldman, a young waiter who had come by briefly that evening. The crime scene was brutal. Police knew immediately this wasn't random. This was personal. Within hours, one name began to dominate every conversation inside the LAPD. O.J. Simpson, her ex-husband, a man with a documented history of domestic disputes, a man who just days earlier had attended their daughter's recital. The public didn't know the details yet, but law enforcement did. And from the very beginning, this case carried a weight most investigations never do. Because this wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about what happens when the suspect is more powerful than the system meant to contain him. Police moved fast. Too fast, some would later argue. Detectives arrived at O.J.'s estate on Rockingham Avenue. They noticed a small cut on his hand. They found blood drops leading through his driveway. To investigators, these were red flags, but in the world of criminal trials, how evidence is collected matters just as much as what the evidence is. And this is where the first cracks appeared. Because from the moment police stepped onto that property, mistakes were made. Small ones, procedural ones, mistakes that would later be magnified on national television, frame by frame, word by word. At the time, no one thought these errors would matter. They thought the case was too strong to fail. They were wrong. As news broke, the media descended like never before. Helicopters hovered overhead. News vans lined the streets. Every development became breaking news. Then came the moment that turned this case into history. June 19th, 1994. O.J. Simpson didn't turn himself in. Instead, America watched live as a white Ford Bronco crawled down the freeway. O.J. inside, holding a gun, speaking to police by phone. 95 million people tuned in. This wasn't a police chase anymore. It was reality television before reality TV existed. And that mattered. Because trials are supposed to happen in courtrooms, not in public opinion. But by the time O.J. was arrested, the jury pool had already been saturated with emotion, speculation, and fear. The case had stopped being about evidence. It was becoming about identity, trust, and sides. Inside the district attorney's office, prosecutors were confident. They believed they had everything. Blood evidence, a timeline that pointed directly at O.J., a history of domestic violence, witnesses, physical evidence connecting the suspect to the scene. To them, This was a case that would end quickly. But what they underestimated was not the defense. They underestimated how fragile a case becomes when it's built in a rush. And they underestimated the power of a legal strategy that didn't try to prove innocence, but instead tried to prove doubt. O.J. Simpson didn't hire just one lawyer. He assembled what the media would later call the dream team. Brilliant legal minds, master strategists, men who understood not just the law, but human psychology. They weren't planning to fight the evidence head on. They were planning to fight how the evidence was handled. And more importantly, they were planning to fight who the jury would trust. Because in American law, there is one rule above all others. If there is reasonable doubt, the jury must acquit. Not may, must. The defense didn't need to prove O.J. innocent. They only needed to prove the system couldn't be trusted. And that's when the case quietly transformed. This was no longer just about what happened that night in Brentwood. It became about whether police corruption could poison an entire investigation, whether fame bends justice, whether procedure matters more than truth. And slowly, subtly, the defense planted a dangerous idea in the public mind. What if the evidence was right, but the process was wrong? Because if the process collapses, so does the case. And this is only the beginning, because the real legal loopholes, the ones that would ultimately free O.J. Simpson, hadn't even been revealed yet. When the trial finally began, most people believed the ending was already written. The evidence looked strong. The suspect was obvious. The country was ready for closure. But what unfolded inside that courtroom wasn't a straightforward search for truth. It was a battle for trust. From the very first day, the defense made one thing clear. This trial would not be about whether a crime happened. It would be about whether the system deserved belief. And that distinction changed everything. Before a single witness testified, before a single piece of evidence was shown, the most important fight had already begun: jury selection. To most viewers, jury selection feels boring, procedural, unimportant. But for elite trial lawyers, it's where cases are truly won or lost. The defense team studied every potential juror like a chessboard, not asking, "Do you know the facts?" but asking, "Who do you trust? Police? Celebrities? The justice system?" This was Los Angeles in the 1990s, a city still carrying deep scars from police misconduct cases and racial tension. The defense didn't need jurors who believed O.J. was innocent. They needed jurors who believed police could lie. And quietly, methodically, they got them. The prosecution came in confident, too confident. They believed the evidence would speak for itself. Blood samples, fibers, footprints. But confidence can be dangerous when it turns into assumption. They assumed the jury would trust the LAPD. They assumed technical details wouldn't need explanation. They assumed mistakes wouldn't matter. What they didn't realize was that every assumption created an opening, and the defense was watching closely, waiting. Blood evidence became the centerpiece. Drops found at the crime scene, traces found in O.J.'s vehicle, samples found at his home. To prosecutors, this was the smoking gun. But the defense didn't argue the blood didn't belong to the victims. Instead, they asked a more dangerous question. How was it handled? Where was it stored? Who touched it? Was it logged correctly? Was it ever left unattended? And suddenly, evidence that once felt ironclad began to feel vulnerable. Not because it was false, but because it was human, and humans make mistakes. This is where the defense truly shined. Witness after witness took the stand. Lab technicians, police officers, experts. And one by one, they were cross-examined. Not aggressively, but surgically. Simple questions, calm tone. Are you certain? Is it possible? Can you rule out? Each question planted a seed. Not proof of innocence, but proof of uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison in a criminal trial. Outside the courtroom, the country was divided. Inside, it was impossible to ignore. For many jurors, this wasn't just a celebrity trial. It was about history, about how the justice system had treated different communities differently. The defense didn't shout this message, they implied it. They referenced past misconduct. They questioned police motives. They framed mistakes as patterns, not accidents. And slowly, the narrative shifted. This was no longer state versus Simpson. It was becoming the people versus the system. Every trial has a moment when momentum shifts. This was it. Detective Mark Furman, a key prosecution witness, took the stand. At first, he seemed solid, experienced, confident, professional. But then, the defense introduced recordings, tapes where Furman used racist language that contradicted his sworn testimony. The courtroom froze, because suddenly the defense didn't need theory. They had proof that a key witness had lied under oath. And if one officer lied, what else could be untrue? The prosecution scrambled. They tried to minimize the damage. They argued Furman's words didn't change the evidence, but they were missing the point. Trials aren't just about facts, they're about credibility. And credibility, once broken, doesn't come back. Every piece of evidence tied to that officer now carried suspicion. Not because it was fake, but because the messenger could no longer be trusted. Then came the moment everyone remembers, the glove. Prosecutors believed this would be dramatic, visual, convincing. They asked O.J. Simpson to try it on in court. Cameras rolled, jurors leaned forward. The glove appeared tight, awkward. It didn't seem to fit. And in that instant, the defense seized the moment. If it doesn't fit, the attorney said calmly, you must acquit. It was a line crafted for history. And it worked, not because of science, but because of spectacle. At this point, the trial had fully transformed. The defense wasn't saying O.J. didn't do it. They were saying the police were careless, the evidence was mishandled, key witnesses lied, the system was flawed, and the law doesn't punish people based on probability. It demands certainty, beyond a reasonable doubt. That phrase echoed in the courtroom, over and over. Outside, opinions hardened. Some believed justice was slipping away. Others believed the trial exposed deep systemic problems. Inside the jury room, the task was simpler and heavier. Not to decide what they felt, but what they could prove. And doubt was everywhere. In closing arguments, the defense brought everything together. They didn't shout, they didn't dramatize. They calmly walked jurors through each mistake, each inconsistency, each unanswered question. They framed the case as a warning. If the system cuts corners here, it can cut corners anywhere. And no juror wants to validate that. As deliberations began, the world waited. Reporters camped outside. TV networks cleared schedules. The nation held its breath. Because the question was no longer, did O.J. Simpson commit the crime? It was now, can the justice system survive its own flaws? And the answer was coming soon.
The jury didn't deliberate for weeks. They didn't debate endlessly. They didn't call for more evidence. After months of testimony, after years of public outrage, they reached a verdict in less than 4 hours. That alone stunned the nation. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, some anxious, some angry, some already celebrating. Inside, the courtroom filled with a silence so heavy it felt unreal. This was it. October 3rd, 1995. The clerk stood. The paper trembled slightly. On the count of murder, a pause, the kind of pause that seems to stretch forever. Not guilty. Gasps erupted. Before the second count was even read, history had already shifted. O.J. Simpson, the man millions believed responsible, was free. Not because the jury declared him innocent, but because the law declared the case unproven. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. The reaction split the country in real time. In some neighborhoods, cheers broke out. In others, people stared at their televisions in disbelief. This wasn't just about one verdict. It was about trust. Trust in police, trust in courts, trust in fairness. For some, the verdict felt like accountability, a system finally questioning its own power. For others, it felt like justice slipping through the cracks. Both reactions were real, both were valid, and both revealed how deeply divided the meaning of justice had become. So how did this happen? Not emotionally, not politically, legally. Here are the loopholes, the quiet mechanisms that changed everything. 1. Evidence handling errors. The defense didn't need to disprove the evidence. They only needed to show it might have been mishandled. That might created doubt. 2. Witness credibility collapse. When a key officer lied under oath, it didn't just hurt one testimony, it infected the entire case. 3. Reasonable doubt is a shield. The law protects against wrongful conviction, even if that means the guilty sometimes walk free. The jury wasn't asked, "What do you believe?" They were asked, "What can you say with absolute certainty?" 4. Narrative beats facts. The defense controlled the story, and stories move people more than spreadsheets of evidence ever will.
The criminal case was over, but the story wasn't. In a civil trial later on, O.J. Simpson was found liable for the deaths. Different standard, different burden of proof. And that contrast exposed something uncomfortable. Truth and legal truth are not always the same. One lives in morality, the other lives in procedure. This trial wasn't about one man. It was about a system being put on trial in front of the world. It taught us that justice depends on process, not emotion. Mistakes, even small ones, can change outcomes forever. The law doesn't promise perfect results, only fair procedures. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it taught us that certainty is rare, even when evidence feels overwhelming. Years later, O.J. Simpson would be convicted of an unrelated crime, not because of complex forensic evidence, but because the case was clean. No shortcuts, no mishandling, no credibility gaps. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The law didn't change, the execution did. So here's the question that lingers. Is it better for the system to sometimes let the guilty walk free, or to risk punishing the innocent? That's the trade-off written into the heart of modern justice. The O.J. Simpson trial didn't break the system, it revealed it. And once you see those cracks, you can't unsee them. If this story made you question how justice really works, if it made you uncomfortable or thoughtful or even angry, then this channel is for you. We don't chase shock. We break down how power, law, and loopholes shape real outcomes. Subscribe for more true stories where the truth isn't simple and the system isn't perfect. And tell me in the comments, do you think the verdict was justice or just legality?